He crawled to the other side of the fort, a marshy meadow separating it from the valley slope, and after some time he managed to sneak up to the palisade. It wasn't even that high.
"Give me your hand,"
Drakainen said, suddenly leaning out from behind a crag. Grunaldi, who had been sitting stubbornly by the tree tied with the rope for hours, jumped back.
"Where did you come from? I just looked down and there was no one there."
"You were looking right at me. You just didn't realize what you were seeing."
"Do they have the children?"
"They do. They're keeping them in a barn right next to the palisade. If you're watching from the side of the gate, it's on your right-hand side. It's a long building. The first door leads to a saddle room, the second to a goat barn and pigsty, and the third is right where the children are locked up. Just don't open the next door. That's the pen where they keep the crabs. They're wild animals. I don't know what they are exactly, but the important thing is they're made entirely of metal and very fast. Right now, there are only 3 left inside because the rest marched out with the riders along the path. I saw how they were fed. Even the snake people are afraid of them. Probably. One of them approached the pen and tossed in a quarter of a pig. Then there was just screaming and the sound of blades, and the meat was gone. Be careful with them. Right now, there are about 15 snakes inside. Both men and women are armed. Get ready. We need to hide in the grove before they bring the goats back from the pasture."
"Why?"
"I'll tell you on the way. Hand me my helmet and bracers."
It started when the young priestess and the boy who had been herding goats with her ran into the fort at sunset, terrified and screaming horribly. As they were returning from the waterfall, driving the herd, they stumbled upon 4 sacred snakes. They were dead, their heads severed, and the blasphemer had strung their bodies onto sticks like gloves and propped them up among the rocks. No one had ever heard of such a thing, and it was completely incomprehensible how it could have happened right by the fort, in the very heart of their valley, with a view right on the petrified wonders, on the way to the sacred waterfall, literally just a few steps away. It was utterly unbelievable, so almost everyone within earshot rushed out of the fort. Even the guard ran out because he was called.
"Look at what kind of guard you are. How is this possible? Right under the fort? Who could have done this? Just look."
So he looked, but he didn't see the man with a sword on his back, who slipped into the fort like a shadow. Just behind the gate, Drakainen turned and followed the palisade until he came across a hay wagon parked by the wall of the barn. He knelt briefly by the front wheels and, with a wide grin, pulled out his multifunctional Swiss Army knife, smuggled in blatant disregard for all directives. Near the handle was a steel ring. The wanderer pulled it, unfurling a 30-centimeter wire saw, an impossibly thin wire with diamond-like sharpness and durability comparable to the mooring rope of a large ship. He slipped the wire over the beam of the wagon shaft and severed it with 3 long pulls.
"You never use all those gadgets," they said.
He muttered under his breath, slinging the shaft over his shoulder as he walked through the alley between the barn and the palisade. He counted his steps until he was at the spot where he had recently heard the terrifying, feverish voices of children, voices that sounded drowsy, as if in a delirium.
"Where's the music? I want the music back. Mommy, mommy, mommy. I want to go to the snake."
He still felt shivers just remembering it. He propped the shaft against the palisade, then jumped up, bracing his legs between the wall and the logs, and climbed onto the barn's roof. Far off, people were shouting at each other, cursing and shaking their fists at the invisible enemy. All because of a few snakes. To them it was as outrageous as if an Arab had found a naked can-can dancer on his prayer rug. Drakainen hauled the shaft up to the roof and suddenly froze in a very uncomfortable position. A tall snake man appeared behind the barn, leaned against the wall and unbuttoned his trousers. Then came the sound of splashing and carefree whistling. Drakainen waited patiently, holding the shaft in mid-air. The snake relieved himself, then, while fumbling with his trousers, suddenly noticed the end of the pole hanging a meter from his head. He followed it with his eyes and, against the darkening sky, saw the wanderer sitting 2 meters above him.
"It's prohibited to piss behind the barn,"
Drakainen murmured reproachfully, then smacked the snake in the face with the end of the shaft. He lifted the pole and tossed it over the palisade, wedging one end between the sharpened stakes. He drew his sword and thrust it into the thatch, slicing through the cords and tearing apart layers of dust-covered old straw. The roofing material tumbled behind the barn, and the wanderer pulled out his knife again, using the wire saw to cut through the beams and rafters of the roof. He then leaned over and, lying on the roof, tore away the beams that formed the floor of the hayloft. He peered inside, and seeing 5 children huddled in a corner, staring up at him with astonished little faces, he withdrew. First stage completed. Screams erupted in the distance, violent and hysterical. There was no time. Stage 2, sabotage. A few arrows, fired from the grove by Grinaldi, stopped the group from searching the nearby bushes. A guard fell onto the path with an arrow protruding from his eye, and a hefty woman with her hair tied up high like reeds soon collapsed on top of him. Another person, limping with an arrow through his leg, wailed as he sought shelter while the rest scattered behind the rocks. Drakainen, bent and almost crouching, sprinted across the roof and jumped onto the thatch covering the main building. Now he had to distract the snakes under fire from the grove and buy some time for the 2 sailors. He took a deep breath, focused, and activated Sifril before unbuckling his quiver and, standing on the roof, drew his bow. He could only fit 2 arrows in his teeth, so he chose 5, stuck them into the thatch, and activated his thermal vision. In the suddenly deepening twilight, the shapeless shadows turned into cold rocks and hot, brightly coloured silhouettes crouching behind them. Drakainen knocked an arrow and aimed into the sky, following the parabolic lines displayed by his program. The older one, crouched behind a sparse cover of dwarf pine, was pointing out a location where Grinaldi might be hiding and shouting something. "Thank you. You won't be pointing anything out here." Another one was running, screaming toward the fort. Next. Next. He loosed the arrows one after another into the air, knowing exactly where they would land, and jumped off the roof. He slid down the slippery straw into the courtyard just in time to collide with a fat snake man hurrying out of a building with an axe in hand. It happened in a split second. Drakainen drove his knee into the man's liver, jammed his thumb into his eye, and then smashed the snake's face with the front of his helmet. He held the falling man and with great effort pushed him onto another fellow who was staggering out the door. The man opened his mouth to scream but was drowned in the thick, syrupy air of acceleration. The wanderer struck him on the temple with his wrist, then leaped lightly and delivered a side kick to the fat man's chest as he slumped. Both snakes tumbled backward, crashing into the interior of the house. He heard them breaking something inside with a long drawn-out crack. Drakainen slammed the door shut and surveyed the courtyard. He spotted a forgotten spear leaning against the wall and jammed the blade into the wooden door, bracing the other end against the ground. Then he tore a handful of straw from the thatch and knelt to strike a spark. Grinaldi and Gjafi burst through the wide-open gate, panting and waving their bows.
"Grinaldi, not you!"
Drakainen shouted.
"Get behind the palisade. You'll be taking over the children. Go to where the shaft is propped up. Move."
Grinaldi spun around and bolted as if demons were chasing him. Drakainen lit the thatch. Cheerful orange flames flared up, sending thick, cream-like clouds of grey smoke billowing into the air. He grabbed a bench and a few barrels and piled them up, barricading the door.
"Gjafi, close the gate. Bar it."
Gjafi slammed the gate shut and pushed the heavy iron bar into place. The pounding on the house door grew more frantic.
"After me! To the roof!"
He clasped his hands together, and as soon as Gjafi's boot pressed into his palms, he heaved him up into the air. The thatch was burning brightly. Somewhere near the stream, the snakes raised a panicked howl, but were too afraid to peek out from behind the rocks, convinced they were being fired upon from multiple directions. Drakainen fired 2 more arrows into the sky, aiming by instinct to keep them in that state of mind. Gjafi helplessly slid back down from the roof and crashed to the ground. The door splintered with a loud crack, struck by something from the inside. A moment later, another blow followed, sending several boards tumbling across the courtyard. Drakainen quickly fired 3 arrows, one after another, into the gaping hole left by the broken boards. A wild scream echoed from within. Gjafi scrambled to his feet, hissing in pain and limping. The door to the enclosure creaked open slowly, and 2 crab-like creatures emerged. They looked grotesque, like dwarves clad in 15th century plate armor, like sea monsters or demons from the canvases of some deranged Dutch painter. Bosch? Bruegel? Take your pick. The metal of their armor was pitted, resembling polished rust. Someone began pounding on the barred gate from outside. Jaffe drew his sword. A roaring mass of flames had already spread across half the roof, consuming the thatch with a deafening crackle. One of the people trapped inside hurled a bench through a narrow window, smashing the shutter, but only managed to wedge the bench in place, blocking the window entirely. The bench now protruded halfway outside. The first crab lunged at him suddenly, untangling its perpetually crossed arms to reveal two curved sabers that had been hidden behind its back. It lifted slightly, and from the flat helmet, slit only by a narrow visor, erupted a shrill scream. The creature was hellishly fast. The alternating blows of its sabers fell with the speed of helicopter rotors. In his accelerated perception, Drakanen saw, as he drew his bow, how the strikes came one after another. Jaffe, gifted with phenomenal reflexes, managed to deflect 3 such blows before his hand was flung upward, severed, and trailing a plume of blood. Drakanen fired 3 arrows directly into the slit of the helmet of the second crab, even as he watched Jaffe fell apart as if caught in a blender. In an explosion of blood, losing limbs and flying away in mid-air, Jaffe was torn apart before he even hit the ground. Those 3 arrows were already pushing the bow's limits. He shot them in less than a second, and the last arrow shattered in the air from the force of the string. The equipment might not withstand shooting at such speed. He tossed the bow aside and drew his sword, parrying 2 of the crab's swift, scorpion-like strikes before thrusting twice between the armor segments. The first crab, struck by the arrows, was blindly stumbling around the courtyard, slashing at anything in its path. Drakanen exited combat mode, but it was too late for Jaffe. He looked as if he had stepped on a landmine. The wanderer sheathed his sword and glanced at the crab, which suddenly sat down and wilted, lightly scraping the ground with its blades. Everything around was spattered with Jaffe's blood as he lay twitching on the ground. It was already too late. There was nothing to be done for him, nor any way to carry him out. There was no time left, but he had to know. The second crab collapsed onto the courtyard with a horrific crash, reminiscent of a car wreck. It was hard to find any fastenings on the armor, but finally Drakanen discovered a joint and pried it apart with force, cutting his hands. Then, as he tugged at a large sheet of metal, he heard rivets popping one by one and managed to slightly lift the helmet. Inside, beneath the metal plates, was something fleshy like the body of a mollusk, full of slimy tendrils and vessels, drenched in some foul mucus, and amidst it all a pale, thin body, and blood.
Mommy, it hurt.
Drakanen heard a metallic voice from within and screamed. He stumbled back, dropping his sword, and continued to retreat.
I want to the snake.
The voice went silent, and Drakanen kept backing away until he hit a wall and slid down it to the ground. He sat there for a moment, until another powerful blow struck the gate. The wanderer shuddered and snapped out of his stupor. The gate shook again, the doors of the burning manor split in half, and he could see several people pushing against them with all their might. He stood up, staggering, picked up his bow, found his sword and sheathed it. Then, with a dead, expressionless face, he launched himself off the ground, grabbed a beam and hauled himself onto the roof. He found the spot where he had torn through the thatch and slipped inside. He moved like a machine. He lifted the children out one by one onto the loft, then onto the roof, not letting them scatter, holding them as if they were kittens. Then he lowered them down the shaft, straight into Grinaldi's waiting arms. He jumped off the roof, pushed off the stakes, and soared into the darkness. The ground rushed up to meet him. He cushioned his fall with a roll and limped after Grinaldi.
Where's Jaffe?
Dead. A crab.
They melted into the darkness, dragging the children who shuffled like sleepwalkers. The snakes yelled, busy storming their own gate and watching their house burn, blinded by the fire and deafened by their own screams and panic. Just like in Africa, Drakanen thought, it was just like in Africa. That's how the warlord armies looked, 14-year-old officers, and the rest were 7 and up. He grabbed 2 of the children under his arms and ran, trying to tread as quietly as possible. When they reached the rope, Drakanen grabbed Grunaldi's arm.
Climb up first,
he said.
You'll pull the children up with Spala, and I'll tie them.
And then you'll come up?
Grinaldi asked firmly.
No. Then I have to go on. Take care of my horse. He will miss me. Keep him, and don't throw away my things. I'll be back.
You can't go alone.
Take the children home. Guard them. It's like if they're poisoned, but I think they'll get better eventually. They might try to run away again. Hurry. Put them on my horse and Jaffe's.
Drakanen pulled out a few arrows and drove them into the ground one by one. The quiver was nearly empty. In the darkness, from the direction of the roaring, sparking fire, he could hear shouts and the sound of running feet.
Ulf, we'll wait for you,
Grinaldi said.
I heard.
Drakanen replied sternly, no time for sentiment. Hard men don't cry.
Grinaldi,
Yes?
my horse. Press your forehead to his and tell him I'll be back, okay?
Okay, friend. If you don't, I'll come back for you. And do you know what those crabs are?
You don't want to know.
They gripped each other's biceps and necks, then Grinaldi began climbing. He paused for a moment.
Nichesefni?
Yes? Bah.
The wanderer replied in Croatian. Drakanen raised his bow and released the first arrow into the darkness. A scream answered. Then he fired 2 more times and tied the first child under the arms with a rescue knot. Another child started to wander off into the darkness, and he had to grab it by the scruff like a kitten. He drew his bow again and fired another shot. 3 pursuers, who finally realized that the others were lying on the ground, either dead or dying from his arrows, retreated. From above, more arrows whizzed down, Grinaldi and Spalle. He smiled. When the last boy was hauled up, sniffling and brushing against the rock, Drakanen stowed his bow and disappeared into the night.
Darkness gives me a sense of safety. As I move through the thicket, I encounter 3 snakes stabbing at clumps of grass and bushes with their spears. The girl is sniffling with rage, and the others have their jaws clenched. They will find him. They will find the bastard who killed the sacred snakes, set their home on fire, and kidnapped their slaves, the one who slaughtered so many of their brothers. So they will search. It doesn't matter that the house is burning, that every pair of hands is needed for the buckets and to tear down the thatch. It doesn't matter that it's completely dark. They won't give up. They will search, even though the culprit has no business being anywhere near here anymore. They stumble into trees, trip over roots, and catch their blades on branches. And they pass by me on both sides, simply because I'm kneeling completely still, with my face lowered and my hand resting on the hilt of my sword. My silhouette doesn't resemble a human figure. It's just a black spot. And above all, it doesn't move. In the darkness, the eye focuses on movement. I wait patiently until they move on, and then I wait even longer. Afterward, I leave their valley. The first moon rises, and it becomes quite bright for me. I stop in a sheltered hollow on the slope of a small, steep mountain. It's not just about the darkness. It's about the spots before my eyes, the hunger, and the exhaustion. A few seconds in combat mode also took their toll. I'm out of gas. I have few supplies. A bundle with a handful of dried meat strips, 2 halva bars, and those new dried fruits that resemble large dates. Just what I stuffed into my pockets. I don't have a canteen. I drank water from a stream recently, but lacking a container could be a problem. I should have taken at least a plastic bottle from the plum brandy. I still had almost half of the rakija. It could have been used to clean wounds, and afterward the bottle would have made an excellent water flask. Too bad. I have what I have, and what I don't need. I feel the urge to hurry. It's instinctual. I know I'm near the end of my journey, and I know it's probably too late. I pull up the hood of my sheepskin coat and hug myself tightly, then find a spot sheltered from the wind. It's 2:20, Wednesday, the 24th of October, according to the local calendar. The air temperature is 6 degrees, and the wind speed is 30 kilometers per hour. Good night, Midgard. Wake up at first light. I collect dew from the grass with my knife blade. Cappuccino a la Coast of Sails. I chew a piece of meat, half a halva bar, and a date. Then I leave my little hollow and head for the summit. I sit on the peak just before dawn. Time for the morning briefing, a survey of the area in the first rays of the sun, and planning the actions for the next 16 hours. Rational, sensible actions. The sun rises, a magnificent moment when the first orange ray squeezes between the peaks and paints the panorama of the mountain range before me. Absolute madness. I was trained to not go insane when faced with children turned into war machines, looking like hellish dwarfs. To not torment myself endlessly when I see an oven speak with a human voice, or when the laws of physics decide to take a stroll. But everything is a matter of scale. I look at the mountains surrounding the long and wide valley and feel a void. It's like a control image or a panic screen message. Your mind has performed an illegal operation and will be shut down. If the problem persists, contact the vendor. I see a mountain that is narrow and rises with gentle lines up to a point where it's sliced off evenly, like by a knife, and on the summit stands a perfect gleaming sphere the height of an office building. Counting from the base, it's about 600 meters high. The sphere stands in water. Water that slowly rotates it, washes over its surface, and then flows away in waterfalls in 5 directions. I see a peak that is a cone, a perfect, slender cone, piercing through another sphere midway up, like a globe the size of a league stadium. Not all of them are geometric, but almost every peak in the vicinity is a sculpture, with deliberate, titanic shapes, showing no trace of tool marks. And in the valley, there are even more bizarre formations, though much smaller, resembling strange fountains, buildings, and pools, shrouded in mist. My mouth hangs open, my eyes wide, and I'm silent. Silent inside and out. I desperately try to remember how one interrupts hallucinations. This is impossible. So I must be poisoned. There must be something in the air here. But my hand looks like a hand. The flock of birds flying below me doesn't transform into bream or pancakes before my eyes. The tufts of grass growing around me are consistent with the atlas for identifying herbaceous plants of the northern continent. When something shouldn't exist but does, I acknowledge it and don't torment myself with questions of how and why. I was trained this way. I descend into the valley, along a long, rounded ridge that stretches below the tilted, overhanging summit. The mountain I'm descending from has soft, flowing lines. I walk on smooth, polished granite as if on a giant tube. The ridge slopes gently but is very slippery. On either side, there's a drop. To the left, a round, deep hollow surrounded by my mountain, and to the right, an exposure to another stream valley. About 200 meters down on each side. Not pleasant. The ridge I'm walking along stretches for about half a kilometer, descending gently. It's slippery. Some climbing spikes and a safety rope would be really handy. After a while, the mists below clear a bit, and I see them flowing through the valley like rivers, cascading between the peaks and merging into one long current. Beyond that, visibility starts to improve. The sun is rising. I look where I'm going and suddenly I stop in shock, because I clearly see that I'm heading towards a foot. A slender feminine foot, lying flat on the ground, in front of an outstretched leg. A foot about 150 meters long. And I'm walking along the arm. I'm approaching the elbow supported on a knee. A stone bridge connecting 2 lower peaks or forearms, lying side by side. I'm descending along the body of a gigantic woman who is sitting with her legs stretched out in front of her, her head hanging down, with her arms resting on her knees. I approach very carefully, as much as one can on the rounded surface of an arm, and look down. I see enormous, spherical breasts topped with nipples the size of squat, turreted bastions. The bowed face isn't very visible from here. The girl has her head hung down, resting on her arms, and she's looking down. The worst part of the descent is crossing the hand. It's steep, and I have to carefully slide down from knuckles to phalanges. Fortunately, the ring and pinky fingers are slightly extended, forming almost steps. 8-meter steps, but steps nonetheless. I feel like Gulliver, though even Gulliver wouldn't be able to handle a woman of these proportions. You could play a basketball game on her hand and fit the spectators too. Thank goodness she's sitting, with her feet stretched out so far. This makes descending the shin arduous but doable. The journey ends with a descent from the toes. It turns out that the nail of the little toe isn't much lower than the others, and from its surface, which could park 2 cars, it's a good 3 stories down to the ground. I descend into the crevice between the toes, and I stand in a surreal valley, surrounded by bizarre sculptures, at the feet of the girl who sat down and rested her head on her folded arms. And thank goodness she sat down. Now it's about 400 meters to the top of her head. When she stands, she'll be a kilometer tall. I feel the madness seeping through the entire valley, and I have a sense that this will be a tough day. Just in case, I activate Sifril.